I counted the animals on June 4th and got 114. I counted them again on June 5th. Same route, same clipboard, same system. Start at the east barn, work through the goat paddock, cross to the sheep runs, count the cattle in the upper pasture, loop through the poultry enclosure, end at the isolation pen beside the vet shed. I marked each animal with a tally and each pen with a subtotal, and I added them at the bottom of the page, the way I've added every column of numbers I've ever been responsible for, which at that point in my life was quite a few. I got 119. No births overnight, no transfers, no intake paperwork, no delivery truck. The gates were locked, the fencing intact, and the overnight volunteer confirmed nothing had moved. 5 more animals than the day before, in a closed system, with no explanation. I reported the discrepancy to the operations manager. He listened, nodded, and told me the official count was 106, and that my job was to maintain the official count, not to conduct my own. He said it kindly enough. He said it the way you'd tell someone a house rule they should have already picked up. I want to be precise about the sequence here, because I've gone back and forth about what I think happened at that place, and precision is the only thing I have left that I trust. So I'll start where the job started, which was mid-May, about 3 weeks before the count. My name is Elaine Cole. I'm 44. I spent 19 years in agricultural accounting, first at a feed co-op in Rockingham County, then as a contract bookkeeper for a string of small livestock operations in the central Shenandoah Valley. I balanced herd books, reconciled USDA compliance filings, tracked depreciation schedules on breeding stock, and made sure the numbers that went to the county matched the numbers that came off the land. That was my whole professional identity. Numbers that match. By 2024, the contract work had dried up. 2 of my long-term clients sold out. 1 went to a management company, and the rest consolidated their books in-house. I was doing part-time data entry at a medical billing clearinghouse in Staunton, and hating every minute of it when I saw the posting. Barren Lick Animal Sanctuary, out past Covington in Allegheny County, needed a seasonal administrative coordinator. April through October, housing included a single wide on the property. Responsibilities included intake documentation, filing, feed and supply record keeping, and quarterly reporting to the county. It was exactly what I'd been doing for 2 decades, just pointed at a nonprofit instead of a commercial operation. I applied on a Wednesday and got a call on Friday from a woman named Marjorie Dre, who introduced herself as the sanctuary's director. She asked about my experience with livestock documentation. I told her. She asked if I was comfortable working with paper files. I said I preferred them. She asked if I was comfortable being the only administrative person on site. I said I'd been the only administrative person at most of my jobs. She hired me over the phone. I started May 12th. Barren Lick is about 40 minutes west of Covington on a county road that turns to gravel about 2 miles before the gate. The property sits in a narrow valley between 2 ridges of the Alleghenies. Technically, Rich Patch Mountain to the east and Potts Mountain to the west, though the locals just call the whole stretch the Lick after the old salt deposits. The sanctuary itself is about 170 acres, mostly hill pasture and second-growth hardwood, with the operational area concentrated in a flat section near the creek. The setup when I arrived looked like what it was: a working animal operation run on not enough money. 2 barns, both metal-sided, one older than the other. A series of paddocks and pens fanning out along the east side. A poultry run enclosed in hardware cloth. A small vet shed that doubled as a supply closet. A workshop. The single wide they'd put me in, which sat about 200 yards from the main barn and had been recently cleaned but not recently maintained, and an office. A converted tack room in the older barn, where the files were. The staff was small. Marjorie ran things and managed the donor side. Dale Purcell was the operations manager, mid-50s, ex-dairy, built like he'd been doing the work since before he could name it. 2 part-time animal care workers, both local, Renee, and a younger guy named Patrick. A veterinary tech named Dr. Caudle, who came out twice a week from a mixed practice in Clifton Forge, and a rotating cast of volunteers, mostly on weekends, mostly from the college in Lexington. Everybody was friendly. Nobody was curious about me. I don't mean they were cold. They were warm, actually, in the rural Virginia way where warmth is a practical thing, offered through action rather than conversation. Dale showed me the feeding schedule, the pen map, and the supply order system. Marjorie showed me the office and the filing cabinets. I was given a key to the tack room and told the quarterly report was due to the county by July 15th. I settled in. The single wide was clean enough. The work was familiar. The animals were goats, sheep, cattle, a few horses, chickens, 2 donkeys, and a handful of pigs. All rescues, all permanent residents. No breeding, no sales, no slaughter. The sanctuary operated as a 501c and received county funding through an agricultural preservation grant, which required quarterly population reports. The first week was filing, the previous admin. A woman named Joan, who'd left in March, had kept the records in a system I understood immediately. Manila folders, color-coded by species, intake forms with dates, descriptions, source information, veterinary records by individual animal, filed by ear tag number, feed orders filed chronologically, correspondence with the county in a separate drawer. I appreciated the order. I said so to Dale, and he nodded. Joan was thorough, he said, and something in the way he said it made me hear a sentence he didn't finish. By the end of my first week, I had the filing system mapped, the feed order history pulled for the last 12 months, and a working familiarity with the pen layout. I'd also started noticing something that, at the time, I filed under nonprofit disorganization and didn't pursue. The feed orders were too high. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would flag an audit. But when I pulled the monthly totals and compared them against the posted population, 106 animals broken down by species, the volume was consistently about 10% over what 106 animals of those species and sizes should consume. I know feed math. I've done it for farms running 600 head. 10% over every month for 12 months is not waste or rounding. It's a pattern. I mentioned it to Dale on a Thursday morning, framing it as a bookkeeping question. I said the feed numbers seemed high relative to head count and asked whether there were animals I hadn't been introduced to. Maybe something in a pasture I hadn't walked. Dale didn't pause. He didn't deflect. He said, "Feed waste runs high in sanctuary settings. Animals aren't optimized for efficiency." Then he handed me a clipboard and asked me to check the mineral block inventory in the sheep run. The answer was technically plausible. It was also the kind of answer you give when you've given it before. I let it go. I had filing to finish, and the feed discrepancy wasn't large enough to affect the quarterly report. But I'd noticed, and noticing is the thing I do that has always eventually gotten me in trouble. The count happened because of the quarterly report. The county requires a population report every quarter, total head count by species, with a reconciliation against the prior quarter showing intake, mortality, and transfers. It's a simple form, 1 page, the kind of thing you fill out in 10 minutes if your records are clean. Joan's records were clean. Every quarter for the past 3 years, the population was 106. The breakdown varied slightly. A goat might die and be replaced by an intake, but the total was always 106, always. I pulled 12 consecutive quarterly reports, and the number never moved. In livestock accounting, a static count across 12 quarters is unusual. Animals die. Animals arrive. Even in a sanctuary with no breeding, the population fluctuates. A total that holds perfectly steady for 3 years looks managed, not real. It looks like someone is keeping the number at 106 regardless of what the actual count is. I didn't assume fraud. I assumed laziness. Maybe Joan had been auto-filling the form and nobody checked. The simplest way to find out was to count the animals myself and reconcile the result against the reported 106. I told Dale I was going to do a physical count for the quarterly report. He looked at me for a moment. Not long, not dramatically, just a beat longer than the statement warranted. Then he said, "The count's on file." I said I preferred to verify in person. Standard practice. He said, "Elaine, the count doesn't need to be redone. It's current." I said, "I'm sure it is. I just want to walk it myself so I can sign the report with confidence." He didn't argue further. He went back to the barn, and I started counting. June 4th. Clear morning, 62 degrees at 7 a.m. I started at the east barn, where the goats are penned in 4 groups. I counted each pen separately, wrote the subtotal on my clipboard, moved to the next. Then the sheep runs, 3 pens, then the cattle in the upper pasture, which required walking the fence line and counting from 2 angles because the pasture has a dip in the middle. Then the horses, the donkeys, the pigs, and finally the poultry enclosure. I got 114, 8 more than the official count. Specifically, 4 extra goats, 2 extra sheep, 1 extra pig, and 1 extra chicken. I double-checked my math. I recounted the goat pens because goats move and can be miscounted. The number held. I went back to the office and pulled Joan's most recent quarterly report. 106. I pulled the intake log. No new animals since February. I pulled the mortality log. No deaths since January. Transfer log. Nothing. So either Joan's count was wrong, or 8 animals had appeared on the property between Joan's last report and my count, with no documentation. Neither option was comfortable. The next morning, June 5th, I counted again. Same route, same method, same clipboard. I got 119. 5 more than the day before. 13 more than the official count. The extras were distributed across species in roughly the same proportions. More goats, more sheep, a couple more chickens. No ear tags I didn't recognize. No animals that looked injured, sick, or recently transported. They were just there, mixed in with the others, eating, standing, behaving like animals that had always been there. I went to Dale's office. I told him I'd gotten 114 on the 4th and 119 on the 5th. I told him no intake paperwork existed for 13 additional animals. I told him the feed discrepancy now made sense. He sat behind his desk and folded his hands. "Elaine," he said, "the count is 106. I just counted 119. The count," he said, "is 106. That's what's on file. That's what goes to the county. That's the number. But there are physically more than 106 animals on this property right now." He didn't disagree. He didn't explain. He said, "You don't need to count them again." I want to describe the way he said it because it matters. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't nervous. He sounded like a man explaining gravity to someone who had just asked why things fall. He sounded like I was the one introducing the problem by naming it. I went back to the office and sat with my clipboard for a long time. Here's what a reasonable person would think. The sanctuary is underreporting its population to the county, probably to keep its funding formula aligned with some cap or efficiency metric in the grant. Marjorie and Dale know the real number. Joan knew it too. They keep the reported count at 106 because 106 is the number that works, and the actual number floats above it, and nobody counts because counting produces a number that can't go on the form. That's what I thought for about 3 days. It was a clean explanation. It accounted for the feed discrepancy, Dale's reaction, Joan's static quarterly reports, and the instruction not to count. The sanctuary was carrying extra animals off the books. Not unusual in rescue operations. You take in more than you report, because reporting them means complying with care standards you can't afford for the overage. The problem was, the number didn't just float. It moved. I counted again on June 7th. I got 121. On June 9th, 117. On June 11th, 124. On June 14th, 111. Each time, I used the same route, the same method, the same clipboard. Each time, I counted every animal I could see in every pen, paddock, pasture, and enclosure. The numbers changed, not in one direction, not by large leaps, but they changed, and they changed in a way that didn't track with anything I could observe. No gates were open, no trucks came, no animals were moved between properties. I checked the fencing, I checked the road, I walked the perimeter. Everything was closed, locked, intact. The animals weren't escaping and returning. They weren't being shuffled between hidden locations. They were simply present in different quantities, on different days, in a closed system, and the variation was real. I started keeping a second ledger, not in the office, in the single-wide, in a composition notebook I'd bought at the Dollar General in Covington. I recorded the date, the weather, the time of count, the route, the subtotals by pen, and the total. I also started noting which animals I could individually identify. There were several with distinctive markings, old injuries, or behavioral quirks I recognized, and whether those individuals were present or absent from count to count. This is where it got specific in a way I want to be careful about. The individually identifiable animals were always present. Every count, the goat with the torn left ear was there. The black-faced ewe with the limp was there. The red bull with the notched horn was there. I never lost a recognizable animal from one count to the next. The variation was entirely in the unrecognizable animals, the ones that looked like every other goat, every other sheep, every other chicken. the generic members of each group. Those were the ones whose number shifted. And because they were generic, I couldn't tell whether they were the same animals from count to count. I could only tell there were more or fewer of them. I tried marking them. On June 16th, I brought a livestock crayon into the goat paddock and put a green stripe on every animal I counted. 29 goats, 29 green stripes. The next morning, I went back. There were 32 goats. 29 had green stripes. 3 did not. They were just goats. Same size, same coat color, same breed mix as the others. Standing in the pen, eating, unbothered, no green stripe. I hadn't slept well the night before, so I entertained the possibility that I'd miscounted or missed 3 goats the previous day. I marked the new 3 and left. The following morning, 31 goats, all marked. 1 fewer than the day before, and the missing one was among the previously unmarked 3. I could tell by the position of the crayon stripe. A goat had appeared, been marked, and then was gone. The green stripe went with it. I sat on the fence rail and thought about what I was actually looking at. In bookkeeping, when a number changes between 2 verified counts and no transaction exists to explain the change, you have one of 3 situations: an entry error, a missing record, or fraud. I had eliminated entry error through repeated counting. I had searched for missing records and found none. Fraud requires a motive and a mechanism, someone physically moving animals on and off the property, and I had found no evidence of either. What I had was a population that changed between observations, not between counts separated by weeks, where something could plausibly happen unrecorded, but between counts separated by hours, in fenced enclosures, on a dead-end gravel road with no traffic. I called a woman I know named Doris Klein, who'd been a county agricultural extension agent in Rockingham for 30 years. I didn't tell her about Barren Lick specifically. I framed it as a hypothetical. If a sanctuary's physical head count didn't match its reported count, and the physical count itself varied day to day with no observable intake or loss, what would she look for? Doris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'd look at the property boundaries." I asked what she meant. "Some of these old mountain places," she said, "the fencing doesn't match the survey. Animals drift across property lines, especially goats. You might be counting animals that belong to adjacent parcels." It was a sensible answer, but it didn't fit. Barren Lick's fencing was tight and well maintained. Dale ran a clean operation physically, whatever the paperwork situation was, and the property on 3 sides was national forest with no adjacent livestock operations. I thanked Doris and hung up. But her comment about property boundaries led me somewhere. I pulled the sanctuary's property file from the office. Every nonprofit receiving county agricultural funding has to have a current survey on file. Barren Lick's survey was dated 2019 and showed 170.3 acres, the same number I'd been told during hiring. The parcel was roughly rectangular, running northeast along the creek, bounded by national forest on the north, east, and south, and by the county road on the west. I took the survey map and walked the fence line the following Saturday. It took most of the day. The western boundary along the road matched. The northern and southern boundaries, running up into the ridges, matched within the margin you'd expect for old mountain fencing following terrain rather than perfect survey lines. The eastern boundary did not match. The survey showed the property ending at a tree line roughly 1,400 feet east of the main barn. The fence continued past that line by what I estimated to be another 600 feet, enclosing an additional section of land that rose into a wooded bench on the lower slope of Rich Patch Mountain. The fencing in this section was older, different post style, different wire gauge, but maintained, repaired in places, not abandoned. Beyond the fence, on the bench, I could see the remains of infrastructure, a collapsed pen structure, a concrete water trough, cracked but intact, what might have been a barn foundation, overgrown with locust saplings, and a second, older fence line continuing east into the woods, beyond which I couldn't see clearly. None of this was on the survey. The county's official record of Baron Lick's property did not include this section, but the sanctuary's operational fencing enclosed it, and it had been maintained. I went back to the office and pulled the county's online GIS parcel viewer. The parcel for Baron Lick ended exactly where the survey said, at the tree line. The additional acreage to the east showed as national forest. So either the sanctuary was enclosing federal land without authorization, or the survey was wrong, or the parcel boundaries had been drawn to exclude something that was functionally part of the operation. I drove to the Allegheny County Courthouse that Monday and pulled the deed history for the Baron Lick parcel. The current deed, transferring the property to the Baron Lick Animal Sanctuary nonprofit, was dated 2006. The transferring party was an estate, the estate of Howard Amos Dray. Marjorie's last name was Dray. The property had been in the Dray family since 1931, when a Howard P. Dray purchased 240 acres from a timber company. 240 acres, not 170. I pulled the chain of deeds. In 1931, 240 acres. In 1958, when Howard P. Dray died and his son Howard A. Dray inherited, still 240 acres. In 1979, a subdivision filing split the parcel into two pieces, a 170-acre western section and a 70-acre eastern section. The 70-acre section was transferred to the United States Forest Service in a conservation easement. That was the bench, the old infrastructure I'd seen. It had been part of the Dray farm until 1979, when it was given to the Forest Service. But the sanctuary's fencing still enclosed it, and the fence was maintained. I want to stop here and say clearly that none of this, by itself, was frightening. A rural nonprofit with a messy property history and some extra acreage behind an old fence line is not unusual. A family that's been on the land for 90 years and keeps maintaining fence they technically don't own anymore is not unusual. I was building a story in my head that was about administrative disorder, not about anything wrong in a deeper sense. What changed my thinking was the agricultural census. The county keeps historical agricultural census data in bound volumes in the basement of the courthouse annex. I asked the clerk if I could see the records for the Baron Lick parcel. She pulled the township plat number and directed me to the right shelf. I found the Dray farm in the 1940 census, the 1950 census, the 1959 census, the 1969 census, and the 1978 census. Each entry listed the acreage, the operator, the crop types, and the livestock count. The livestock count was 106, not roughly 106, not approximately 106. Exactly 106 in every census across 38 years. 1940, 106 head of mixed livestock. Howard P. Dray, operator. 1950, 106 head. 1959, 106 head, Howard A. Dre, operator. 1969, 106 head. 1978, 106 head. The species breakdown changed slightly across the decades. More cattle in the earlier years, more sheep later. But the total was always 106. The same number that had been on every one of Jones' quarterly reports. The same number, Dale told me, was the count. A number that had been the count since 1940, maybe longer, maybe since 1931. I sat at the courthouse table and felt something I didn't have a name for. Not fear exactly, more like the sensation of stepping on what you thought was solid ground and feeling it give slightly. Not enough to fall through, but enough to know the structure underneath was not what you assumed. I photographed every census page. I drove back to the sanctuary. I went to the single wide and added the census data to my composition notebook. Then I sat on the steps and looked east, toward the bench, toward the old infrastructure, toward the 70 acres that had been given away in 1979, but never really let go of. The next morning I counted the animals. I got 106. For the first time, the count matched the number. And I want to tell you that it felt worse than any of the other counts. Because 114, 119, 124, those were numbers I could investigate, discrepancies I could work with. But 106 was the number that agreed with everything. The quarterly reports, the census, the official filing. It was the number that had always been true according to every piece of paper that existed. And I knew it wasn't true. I'd counted 124 animals on this property 8 days earlier. I'd marked them with crayon. I'd watched one appear and disappear. And now the physical population had settled exactly into the shape the paperwork demanded. I didn't count again for 6 days. I told myself I was focusing on other work. The quarterly report was due in 3 weeks, and there was filing to organize. But the truth was that I didn't want to see the number move again, and I didn't want to see it hold still either. During that week, I watched the staff. I watched Marjorie, who came out to the property twice a week and spent most of her time on the phone with the donors. I watched Dale, who ran the daily operation with a competence that I genuinely respected. The animals were well cared for, the infrastructure was maintained, the feeding schedule was exact. I watched Renee, who'd been there 4 years and handled the goats and sheep with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd grown up on a farm. I watched Patrick, who'd been there 6 months and mostly did fencing, mucking, and heavy lifting. None of them counted. I realized this slowly, the way you realize a sound has been absent. They fed animals by pen, a set amount per pen, not per head. They administered medications by pen, noting which individuals were treated, but never totaling the group. Dr. Caudle did her veterinary checks by pulling specific animals for examination, never by surveying the whole population. Nobody ever counted. And they moved through the operation with a fluency that didn't require counting. Dale knew which gate to open by time of day, not by checking who was where. Renee distributed feed with the muscle memory of someone who'd been doing the same motion with the same volume for years. The operation ran on routine and spatial memory, and it worked, and counting was simply not part of the process. I approached Renee on a Wednesday during the afternoon feeding. I asked her how many goats were in pen 2. She looked at me. "Enough," she said. "I mean the number." "I know what you mean." She hefted a feed bag. I don't count them, Elaine. Ever? She put the bag down and turned to face me fully. She was maybe 30, sun-darkened, with the kind of lean strength that comes from physical work rather than exercise. Her expression wasn't hostile. It was something more unsettling. It was patient. "You've been counting," she said. "It's my job. Your job is the paperwork, the filing, the quarterly report. The quarterly report requires a count. It requires a number," she said. "The number is 106. I opened my mouth. She kept going. "You're not the first person who's counted. Joan counted, her first month." She stopped. "The woman before Joan. I don't remember her name. She counted too." She stopped faster. Renee picked the feed bag back up. "The number is 106. You put 106 on the form and you send it to the county, and you don't walk pen to pen with a clipboard, because walking pen to pen with a clipboard gives you a number that isn't 106. And then you have a problem that nobody can solve and everybody has to deal with." She walked to the next pen. I stood there. It would have been easy to interpret Renee's words as a threat or as participation in a cover-up, but that's not how they landed. They landed like advice. Practical, rural, hard-won advice from someone who had seen this before and was trying to save me the trip. I didn't take the advice. The next morning, I pulled the veterinary records from the filing cabinet. Not the general health logs, but the individual animal files. Dr. Caudle kept meticulous records. Each animal had a file keyed to its ear tag number. I went through every file and compiled a list of every tag number that had a current veterinary record. I got 106 active tag numbers. Then I went outside with the list and walked every pen, reading ear tags. This was harder than a head count. You have to get close to each animal, which in the case of goats means either cornering them or waiting for them to hold still, which goats don't do willingly. It took me 4 hours. I read every tag in every pen and paddock. I found all 106 tag numbers from the veterinary list, and I checked them off one by one. I also counted 12 animals with no ear tags at all. 12 goats, sheep, and chickens, mixed among the tagged population, the same breeds, the same sizes, the same condition, with no ear tags and no corresponding veterinary files. Animals that existed physically, but not administratively. I wrote the 12 tagless animals in my composition notebook. I described each one as specifically as I could. A brown and white Boer cross doe with no distinguishing marks, a white Katadine cross ewe, a barred rock hen, and so on. I noted their pen locations. The next morning, I went to check on the 12. I found 8 of them. The other 4 were gone. Not dead, not escaped. Just not there. And in their place, or near their place, were 3 different untagged animals I hadn't seen the day before. The tagged animals, the 106, were always stable, always present, always identifiable, always accounted for in the veterinary records. They were the skeleton of the population, the fixed architecture. Everything around them shifted. I tried to understand this mechanistically. I spent an evening in the single wide with my notebook, trying to model it as something with a rational explanation. The best I could construct was an elaborate theory involving feral animals entering through a gap I hadn't found, mixing with the population temporarily, and leaving. But feral goats in the Alleghenies aren't common. The fencing was sound, and the animals showed no signs of being feral. They were calm, well-fed, comfortable around humans, and had clearly been on pasture. The second best theory was that someone was running animals onto the property at night, but there was no motive I could identify. No tire tracks on the single-lane gravel road, and no neighbor within miles running livestock. I kept coming back to the census records, 106 since 1940, and the property had been a working farm before it was a sanctuary with different animals, different operators, different decades, and the same number. On June 28th, I went to see Marjorie. She worked from a home office in Covington, a tidy bungalow on the north side of town. She met me at the door and invited me into her kitchen. She was in her late 60s, gray-haired, clear-eyed, with the bearing of someone who'd administered things her whole life. She poured me coffee without asking if I wanted it. I told her what I'd found, all of it. The variable counts, the untagged animals, the feed discrepancy, the census records, the 70 acres, the old infrastructure. I put my composition notebook on her table. I was professional. I didn't accuse her of anything. I framed it as an administrative problem I needed help resolving. Marjorie listened to everything. She looked at my notebook. She turned the pages carefully. When I finished, she closed the notebook and slid it back across the table. "My father ran cattle on that land for 40 years, she said. "My grandfather ran them before that. My grandfather's father bought the place in 1931. Before that, the timber company ran draft horses on it." She sipped her coffee. "Elaine, the land keeps 106 animals. That's what it does. That's not how livestock works. I know it's not. Animals don't. A population doesn't just hold at a number for 90 years. I know it doesn't." She wasn't arguing with me. She was agreeing, and the agreement was the thing that made the room feel wrong. "My father tried to expand the herd in 1965, she said. "Bought 20 head of Herefords at the Lewisburg sale, brought them home, put them on pasture. Within a month, he was back at 106. No deaths, no escapes. He just counted one morning and had 106. The new cattle were there. He could identify them by their sale tags, but the total hadn't changed. Some of the old herd was just gone. No carcasses, no sign, gone." She set down her cup. "My grandfather told my father not to count. My father told me, I'm telling you." "Why 106? "I don't know. Has anyone ever investigated this? A vet, a land agent, anyone?" "My father called the extension office once, in 1968. They sent a man out. He counted 106. He said the records looked fine. He left." She paused. 106 is the number every outside count gets too. It's only when you count repeatedly, when you're here, day after day, watching, that you see it move, and then it only moves for you. That doesn't make sense. No, it doesn't. Marjorie, I can't file a quarterly report with a number I know is wrong. "The number isn't wrong," she said. 106 is the most accurate count of that land. It's been accurate for longer than anyone living has been alive. What's wrong is thinking you can get a different number by counting more carefully. I drove back to the sanctuary. I sat in the single wide. I opened my composition notebook and looked at my tallies. The daily counts that varied from 111 to 124. The tagged population that held steady at 106. The untagged animals that appeared and disappeared. I started a new page and wrote, "What is 106?" And then I did something I should have done earlier. I went back to the census records, not the Dre farm specifically, but the entire township. I had the photographs on my phone. I scrolled through the agricultural census pages for every farm in the surrounding district, looking at livestock counts across the decades. Most farms showed normal variation. Herds grew, shrank, turned over. Numbers fluctuated by 10, 20, 40% between census years. But 3 other farms in the township showed the same pattern as the Dre's. Static counts, holding perfectly steady across decades. The Brennan place on Pot Creek, 74 head, every census from 1940 to 1978. The Osborne farm on Smith Creek, 61 head, same period. The Carper parcel near Paint Bank, 43 head. I added them up. 106, 74, 61, 43. The sum was 284. I didn't know what to do with that number, so I wrote it down and kept going. The Brennan, Osborne, and Carper farms were all gone now. I checked the current GIS parcel data. The Brennan place had been subdivided into residential lots. The Osborne farm was a state wildlife management area. The Carper parcel had been absorbed into the national forest. None of them operated as farms anymore, but they had all held static counts on land in the same valley system during the same decades, and they had all stopped appearing in the census record after 1978, the same year the Dre farm subdivided and gave its eastern 70 acres to the Forest Service. Something happened in 1978 or 1979, something administrative, something structural, that touched all 4 properties. I couldn't tell what it was from the census data alone. I went back to the courthouse. I spent an entire day in the deed room and the planning office. I pulled every transaction involving the 4 properties between 1975 and 1982. What I found was this. In 1979, Allegheny County adopted a new comprehensive land use plan. The plan rezoned significant portions of the western county from agricultural to conservation use. All 4 properties were affected. The Brennan, Osborne, and Carper parcels were rezoned entirely, which effectively ended their agricultural operations within a few years. The Dre parcel was split. The western 170 acres retained its agricultural zoning, while the eastern 70 acres were rezoned conservation and transferred to the Forest Service. The rezoning was part of a federal watershed protection initiative. The paperwork was routine. The Planning Commission minutes showed no controversy, no opposition, just a standard bureaucratic process that redrew the boundaries of what the land was allowed to be. But here's what I noticed in the planning minutes, and I want to be precise. The population figures cited in the rezoning justification for each property matched their static census counts. The county used the census data to argue that the agricultural operations on these parcels were stable and non-expanding, which supported the case for conservation rezoning. The county used the number 106, 74, 61, 43 to justify removing the agricultural classification. The number was the argument for changing the land, and the land was the thing that maintained the number. I sat in the courthouse and felt the ground shift again, not under my feet, under the assumption I'd been carrying my whole life, that numbers describe things, and things exist before the numbers, and the numbers are always downstream of reality. What if, on this land, The relationship ran the other way. I drove back to the sanctuary late in the afternoon. The light was golden, and the animals were grazing in the upper pasture. Cattle on the slope, sheep in the flat, goats working the brush line. I parked by the barn and walked to the fence and stood there and did not count. I stood there for 20 minutes, watching, and I felt the pull to count, the pull to know how many. It was the same impulse that had governed my entire career, the need to make the number match the reality. And I understood, standing at that fence, that here, on this land, the impulse itself was the problem. Not because counting was dangerous in some supernatural sense, but because counting created a discrepancy that demanded resolution. And the only resolution available was the one the land had always offered, 106. The count would resolve. It always resolved. The question was what you saw in the interval before it did. I went back to the single wide and made dinner and tried to think about something else. I couldn't. I opened the composition notebook and reread every entry, every daily count, every note. I looked at the numbers, and I noticed something I'd missed. The daily counts, which I'd been treating as random fluctuations, weren't random. They correlated with the feed orders. Dale placed feed orders every 2 weeks through a supplier in Clifton Forge. I had the order records because filing them was part of my job. The orders varied slightly. Not every 2-week order was the same size. The variation was minor, a few bags more or less, but it was there. When I plotted my daily animal counts against the feed delivery schedule, the correlation was nearly perfect. On days following a larger-than-average delivery, the count was higher. On days following a smaller delivery, the count was lower. The population tracked the feed supply, not the other way around. Dale wasn't ordering feed based on how many animals he had. The animals were present based on how much feed was available. I went to Dale the next morning. I didn't show him the correlation. I just asked a simple question. How do you decide how much feed to order? He was in the barn, checking a water line. He didn't look up. Same as always. Standard order, adjusted for the season. Adjusted how? More in winter, less in summer. Little more before a storm front, little less if pasture's good. You don't base it on head count. Now he looked up. No. You've never based it on head count. Elaine, he set down the wrench. I order what the land needs. The land takes care of the rest. What does that mean? It means what it means. He picked the wrench back up. You're a numbers person. I can see that. You want it to work like a ledger. It doesn't. It works like a farm. Like this farm. And this farm has been working the same way since before I was born. He wasn't hostile. He was tired. Tired the way you get when you've explained something obvious to someone who keeps asking you to explain it differently. I went back to the office and pulled Dale's employment file. He'd been at the sanctuary since its incorporation in 2006. Before that, he'd worked the dray farm as a hired hand since 1989. Before that, he'd worked the Brennan place. The Brennan place, where the count was 74. I found his emergency contact information. A sister in Low Moor. I found a phone number and called it that evening from my single wide. A woman answered. I told her I was a colleague of Dale's and was trying to track down some historical records about properties he'd worked on. She was friendly. She talked about Dale for a while. how he'd always been good with animals, how he'd worked on farms since he was 16. I asked about the Brennan place. He was there maybe 3 years, she said, before the Brennans sold out. Nice little place up on the creek. Dale always said it was the easiest place he ever worked. Everything just ran, you know? Like the farm already knew what it was doing. Did he ever mention anything about the livestock count? A pause. Not long. I don't know what you mean, she said. And the way she said it told me she did. A fixed count. A number that didn't change. I think you should ask Dale about that, she said. And the conversation wound down and ended. July arrived. The quarterly report was due on the 15th. I had 2 weeks to decide what number to write on the form. I counted 3 more times in the first week of July. I got 116, 109, and 122. Then I counted on July 8th and got 106. Exactly 106. And every tagged animal accounted for, and 0 untagged animals visible. The land was offering me the number. It was offering it right when I needed it, right before the deadline, like a student who's been acting up all semester and then sits perfectly still when the principal walks in. I filed the quarterly report on July 14th. I wrote 106. I signed it. I sent it to the county. And then I went back to the office and opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet where Joan's personal files had been kept. Not the official sanctuary files, but a folder labeled Joan Personal that I'd glanced at during my first week and assumed was insurance paperwork or something similarly mundane. It wasn't insurance paperwork. It was a composition notebook, just like mine. Joan's handwriting was small and neat, and the entries were dated from May through October of the previous year. She'd counted, too. She'd gotten different numbers. She'd found the census records. She'd found the extra acreage. She'd mapped the tagged versus untagged populations. She'd plotted the counts against feed deliveries. She'd gone to the courthouse. She'd found the static counts on the neighboring farms. She'd done everything I'd done, in the same order, arriving at the same observations. Reading her notebook was like reading my own thoughts in someone else's hand. But Joan had gone further than I had. In August of the prior year, she'd driven to the State Library in Richmond and pulled the original 1931 deed of sale for the Dre property. Attached to the deed was a survey map from the timber company, and on that survey map, in small notations along the eastern boundary, were what the timber company surveyor had labeled livestock tallies from previous operations. The property had been a farm before the timber company bought it, before 1931, and the livestock tallies on that pre-1931 survey, noted for 4 separate dates across what appeared to be the 1910s, were 106, 106, 106, 106. The number predated the Dre's. It predated the timber company. It went back at least to the 1910s, and probably further, but Joan couldn't find records earlier than that. Joan's final entry was dated October 3rd of the previous year. It read, "I'm leaving this for whoever comes next. You'll count. Everyone counts. The number is real, and the number is wrong, and both things are true. I filed 106 for every quarter. The land has always been 106. I don't know what happens to the animals that aren't 106. I don't know where they come from or where they go. I don't know if they're real in the way the 106 are real. I don't think anyone knows. I don't think the land knows. I think the land just holds a number the way a jar holds water. It has a capacity, and the capacity is 106, and everything else is overflow, and the overflow is not quite here and not quite gone. Don't count. You won't be able to stop, but try. I closed Joan's notebook and sat in the office for a long time. The thing about Joan's explanation, and I want to be fair to it, because she'd lived with this longer than I had, is that it was poetic, and it was honest, and it was exactly the kind of conclusion you reach when you've exhausted the rational options, and you need something that accommodates the data, even if it doesn't explain it. But I'm not a poet, I'm a bookkeeper, and the bookkeeper in me noticed something in Joan's data that Joan apparently hadn't. Her daily counts, which she'd listed in a table near the back of the notebook, followed the same feed-delivery correlation I'd found, but they also correlated with something else. Joan had recorded the weather each day, temperature, precipitation, wind, and when I plotted her counts against temperature, there was a secondary pattern. On cooler days, the count was lower. On warmer days, higher. The effect was smaller than the feed correlation, but it was consistent. More feed, more animals. Warmer weather, more animals. Both things that increase biological activity on pasture land. The count wasn't random. It wasn't supernatural in the way that word is usually meant. It was responsive to inputs, responsive to conditions. The land was producing animals the way a field produces grass, in proportion to what was available to sustain them, and 106 was the baseline, the carrying capacity, the number the land returned to when nothing extra was being added. I want to be very careful here, because I know how this sounds. I'm not saying the land was growing animals the way soil grows plants. I'm saying that the population fluctuated in a pattern that followed agricultural inputs, anchored to a historical baseline that had been stable for over a century, and that the fluctuation occurred in animals that had no ear tags, no veterinary records, and no persistent identity from one count to the next. The 106 tagged animals were real. They had histories, health records, individual identities. They were the permanent population. Everything above 106 was something else, something that looked like an animal, behaved like an animal, ate like an animal, and then was simply not there when conditions no longer supported its presence. And nobody was supposed to count, because counting revealed the seam between the permanent population and the overflow, and once you saw the seam, you couldn't stop looking at it, and looking at it was, I'll be honest, destabilizing in a way I don't have professional language for. I stopped counting for 3 weeks. I did my filing. I organized the supply records. I helped Renee with the goats when she needed an extra hand. I ate dinner in the single wide and read novels and tried to let the knowledge settle into something I could carry without it changing my posture. Then, on July 29th, something happened that I haven't been able to settle. I was in the office filing veterinary records when I came across a file I hadn't seen before. It was in the individual animal section, keyed to an ear tag number, 0107. The highest tag number in the sanctuary system was 0106. Every animal had a sequential tag number, 0001 through 0106. I'd verified this myself. There was no 0107. I opened the file. Inside was a single veterinary intake form, filled out in Dr. Caudle's handwriting. Species, human. Sex, female. Age, 44. Condition on intake, healthy, No abnormalities noted. Tag number 0107. Under name, it said, Elaine Cole. My hands were steady. I want to note that because it surprised me. My hands were steady, and my breathing was even, and I read the form twice, and my hands were steady. The date on the form was July 15th, the day after I'd filed the quarterly report. The day after I'd written 106 and signed it and sent it in. I looked at the form for a long time. Then I put it back in the filing cabinet and closed the drawer. I went to find Dr. Caudle. She was in the vet shed, cleaning instruments. I asked her about file 0107. She looked at me over her glasses. I don't have a file 0107. I just found one, in the cabinet, with your handwriting. I've never written a file numbered 0107. The last intake was 0104, the bay mare, in February. Can you come look at it? She dried her hands and followed me to the office. I opened the filing cabinet. The file was gone. I went through every folder in the drawer. 0104, 0105, 0106, no 0107. Dr. Caudle watched me search. She didn't seem concerned. Elaine, she said, are you sleeping okay? I saw it. I believe you think you saw it. It was in your handwriting. She paused. Then she said very gently, has anyone talked to you about counting? I didn't answer. She left. I went back to the single wide and pulled my composition notebook from under the mattress where I'd started keeping it. I opened it to the last entry and read it. The last entry was not in my handwriting. It was in Joan's handwriting, the same small, neat script from Joan's notebook, and it said, Count 107, new intake, see file. I sat on the bed and looked at the page. I turned back through the notebook. Every entry before this one was mine. My handwriting, my dates, my tallies. Only the last entry was Joan's. Except that Joan had left in March, 5 months before, and my notebook had been under my mattress in a locked single wide. I want to describe what I did next because it's the part that I think matters most, and it's the part I have the least explanation for. I went outside. It was late afternoon, still warm, the kind of July evening in the mountains when the light goes golden and the insects start up and everything feels held in amber. I walked to the upper pasture where the cattle graze. I stood at the fence, and I counted. I counted every animal I could see across every pen and paddock and pasture visible from the high ground. I counted methodically, section by section, the way I'd done every time. I used my clipboard. I used my tally marks. I counted for 40 minutes as the sun went down. I got 107. 106 tagged animals in their usual places, going about their usual business. And one extra. One animal I couldn't identify, standing in the upper pasture among the cattle. Not a cow. Smaller, wrong shape, wrong posture. Standing upright. At that distance, in that light, I couldn't resolve it clearly. It was at the far end of the pasture, near the tree line, near the boundary where the survey ends and the old acreage begins. It was in the count. Whatever it was in the count. It was number 107, and it was standing where no animal should stand, at the seam between the land that's on the books and the land that was given away. I lowered the clipboard. The shape didn't move. The light was going. I stood there until I couldn't see it anymore, and then I walked back to the single wide. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't count the next day. I went through the motions of work, filing, calls, supply orders, with the mechanical precision of someone operating from training rather than thought. Dale looked at me once in the morning and looked away. Renee brought me coffee and didn't ask questions. On August 1st, I drove to Covington and sat in a McDonald's parking lot and called my sister in Harrisonburg. I told her I needed to talk. She asked what was wrong. I said I wasn't sure. She said to come whenever I wanted. Then I drove back to the sanctuary and went to the office and opened the filing cabinet. File 0107 was there again. Same form, same handwriting, same intake data. Species, human. Name, Elaine Cole. But the date had changed. It now read August 1st, today's date. And there was a new line I hadn't seen before at the bottom of the form where Dr. Caudle usually noted treatment plans. It said, "Acclimating well. No intervention required." I took the file out of the cabinet. I held it in my hands. I walked out of the office and into the daylight and held it up and looked at it in full sun to make sure it was real, that it was paper, that it had weight and texture and was not something I was generating inside my own head. It was paper. It was real. It was there. I carried it to my car and locked it in the glove compartment. Then I went back to the office. I pulled every one of Joan's quarterly reports. 12 of them, 3 years, all reading 106. I stacked them on the desk. I pulled my own quarterly report from the sent mail file. I put it on top. Then I pulled the personnel files. Mine was thin. The application, the offer letter, a W-4. Joan's was similarly thin. The woman before Joan. Her name was Deborah Pruitt, I could see now. Had a file too, and it was even thinner. I pulled all 3 and compared them. My start date was May 12th, 2025. Joan's was April 8th, 2024. Deborah's was March 15th, 2023. Each one had lasted approximately 6 months. Each one had started in spring. Each one had handled the filing, the feed records, and the quarterly reports. Each one had been the only administrative person on site. And in each personnel file, on the last page, was a small notation in pencil. Not typed, not part of the official form. A single number. In Deborah's file, 0105. In Joan's file, 0106. In mine, 0107. Sequential. Each admin assigned the next number in the ear tag sequence, not metaphorically, not as a joke. As a tag number, written in the same pencil, in the same position, on the same form. I put the files back. I went to my car and checked the glove compartment. The 0107 veterinary file was still there. I opened it and read it again, all of it, word for word. At the bottom, below acclimating well, no intervention required, there was a new line. It had not been there when I locked the file in the car 20 minutes earlier. It said, "Count adjusted. Population, 107. I closed the file. I started the car. I drove to the gate, down the gravel road, onto the county road, and I kept driving until I hit I-64 and merged into the westbound traffic flow and didn't stop until I was in Harrisonburg, in my sister's driveway, with the engine running and my hands on the wheel. I didn't go back for my things. I called Marjorie the next day and told her I was done. She said she understood. She said she'd mail my last check. She asked if I'd left the filing in order. I said yes, She said, "Thank you, Elaine. You did good work." That was August 2nd. I'm writing this in late September. Almost 2 months. 3 things have happened since I left that I need to include. The first, my composition notebook was under the mattress in the single wide. I didn't take it. A week after I left, a package arrived at my sister's house. No return address, postmarked Covington. Inside was the notebook. Every page exactly as I'd left it, except the last page, which now had a new entry, not in my handwriting and not in Joan's. The handwriting was older, more formal, the kind of cursive they taught in schools 60 years ago. It said, "Count adjusted. Population 106. I was back out. The count had corrected. I was no longer in the number. The second, I checked the Barren Lick Animal Sanctuary's website, which I hadn't looked at before because it was a bare-bones WordPress site with donation information and not much else. The About page had a section listing the animals currently in residence. It said, "Barren Lick is home to 106 permanent animal residents." Below that was a staff section. It listed Marjorie, Dale, Renee, Patrick, and Dr. Caudle. It did not list an administrative coordinator. The position wasn't vacant, it just wasn't listed, as if it didn't exist. And the third thing, the thing that made me write all of this down, the veterinary file, 0107, the one with my name on it, was still in my glove compartment. I'd forgotten about it. I found it last week when I was looking for my registration. I opened it. The intake form was blank. Species, name, tag number, all of it. Blank. Just an empty form, the kind you'd use for a new intake, with nothing filled in yet, as if the file was waiting. I turned it over. On the back, in pencil, in that old formal cursive, someone had written a number. I looked up the sanctuary's website again. The staff section still didn't list an admin coordinator, but it did have a new line I hadn't seen before at the very bottom, in smaller text. Now hiring, seasonal administrative coordinator, April through October. My quarterly report is still on file with the county. I checked. It says 106. It will always say 106. But I keep thinking about the form in my glove compartment and the number on the back, and the woman who will drive down that gravel road next April with a background in agricultural bookkeeping and a belief that numbers describe reality, and how she'll settle into the single wide and start filing and notice the feed orders are too high and decide to count. Because that's what people like us do. We count. And the land will let her. It always lets you count. That's the thing no one tells you. The prohibition isn't enforced. Nobody will stop you. You're told not to count the way you're told not to scratch a mosquito bite. Not because anyone can prevent you, but because the scratching makes it worse, and the worse never heals. I don't know what the animals are. The ones without tags, the ones that come and go, the overflow that appears when conditions support it and vanishes when they don't. I don't know if they're real in the way the 106 are real. I don't know if the land is producing them, or attracting them, or remembering them, or something else entirely that I don't have the right word for. I know that the number is old. Older than the drays, older than the timber company, maybe older than the county records go. I know that the number is 106 and that it has been 106 through changes of ownership, changes of species, changes of use. and the complete turnover of every living thing on the property multiple times over. I know that the number is the most stable thing about that land, more stable than the buildings, the fences, the road, the trees, the people. And I know that when I counted, when I insisted on getting the real number included me. I don't go to the glove compartment anymore. The form is still there. I can feel it when I drive, the way you can feel a letter you haven't opened. The 108 on the back waits for someone who doesn't exist yet, and when she exists, the form will fill itself in, and the count will adjust, and everyone at the sanctuary will go about their work, and not count, and not ask, and not look at the seam where the permanent meets the overflow. I filed 106. That's the number. That's always the number. But I counted 107 once, at sunset, standing at a fence in the mountains, and one of the 107 was me.